To understand the moon in the first house, let's begin with a quick review of what the moon symbolizes and what the first house symbolizes. Then we can get into the theory of what the moon in the first house represents, how you would interpret it. Then we'll put that theory into practice on 4 actual charts and see how it actually works in real cases. And we'll use the charts of famous people: Krishna, Rama, Oprah, and Priyanka. So let's start off with a review of the first house. You can see here what the first house physically is. The first house is literally the area of sky around the eastern horizon. And the eastern horizon is what? It's where the sun rises. That's the root of everything the first house represents. Sunrise has to do with beginnings. So the first house represents the beginning of the thing that's being described by the chart. So let's say your birth. The beginning of what? The birth of what? The birth of your body. And what does the body do? It establishes and reinforces a center for our sense of self. The sunrise also represents things becoming visible. So it's all about things becoming more manifest, more expressed, and more tangible. And hence it represents the traits, the real qualities of a thing. What it looks like, what it tastes like, what it smells like, what it acts like, etc. Now let's have a review of what the moon represents. It's a little bit more complicated than the first house. Think about the moon. What are 3 obvious characteristics about it? It comes out at night. It's very, very bright. And it changes a lot. Those are the 3 foundations of what the moon represents. So let's talk first about the fact that it is the planet which dominates the night compared to the sun which dominates the day. The night is what compared to the day? It's private, it's unseen. The day is public, you go out and you see things. The night is private, you stay inside and you don't see things. So the night has to do with unseen things, and that's why the moon represents privacy, private things. It has a shyness to it. It's about personal things. Things which you don't necessarily share with others. It's about domestic things or things which happen inside a private space. And hence the moon is a feminine planet and represents feminine things because the female sex organs are unseen. They go in compared to the male sex organs which are seen. They come out. Now to evolve the concept of the night being unseen a little bit, unseen things exist but they're not seen. That means they are internal. They're on the inner part of something beyond what you see, right? So because the moon dominates the night, it has to do with things which are unseen, which means it has to do with things which are below the surface or internal. This is why the moon symbolizes the mind, and it's probably the most important thing to understand about the moon. By the mind, we don't mean the part of you that gets tested on an IQ test. That's a separate thing, that's intellect, and that's Mercury. Mind means what we often call your heart, where you experience life, what you feel, etc. And this is why the moon is the planet of emotions, because emotions are the currency of the mind. And furthermore, the root cause of emotion is desire. We feel happy or sad based on whether we fulfill or don't fulfill desires. And so the moon has to do with our desires, and desires are based on opinions. We want what we think is good and we don't want what we think is bad. So the moon has to do with opinions, subjectivity, and bias. Now all of that symbolism is simply because of the basic fact that the moon comes out at night and is very prominent at night. Now let's look at some important symbolism derived from the fact that the moon is super bright compared to anything else that's out at night. So this is why the moon symbolizes beauty, something which is eye-catching, stunning. And this is also why the moon represents authority. Like the sun and moon represent authority figures. But the sun represents masculine archetype authorities, and the moon represents feminine archetype authorities. So, like archetypically, who's that? Mom, compared to the sun, who's dad. Finally, let's derive some meaning from the fact that the moon changes a lot, and that is simply that the moon represents change or flux, cyclic change. So things having a rhythm or pulse, and things being fluid. Now that we understand clearly the moon and the first house, we can put them together and dive into the subject of what happens when the moon goes into the first house. There's a pretty big issue here, is that the first house is about sunrise, but the moon is about the night. And so the first house has to do with things becoming more visible and more seen, and the moon has to do with things becoming less visible, more hidden, more private. And that also comes to do with the privacy of the moon versus the manifestability of the first house, and also the fact that the moon is the mind, whereas the first house is the body. And so we can derive an interpretation of the moon in the first house from this basic fact. And that interpretation is, if you have the moon in the first house, you have a complex way of manifesting yourself. It's not an obvious, simple way that you express, show, and manifest your being. It will be difficult to understand your emotions, for example, as an observer watching your behavior. You may have completely different emotions than what you're showing. Conversely, it may be difficult for you to figure out a way to express your actual emotions. So there's this complexity between the hidden thing and the manifest thing, where the manifest thing, there's like a disconnect between the two. So the moon and the first house kind of conflict in the sense that the moon is very private, but the first house is very visible. However, the moon is also very bright. This is what makes the moon very complex itself. It's the nighttime planet, but it's super bright. So we have to, at the same time, consider the fact that the moon and the first house get along, in that the moon is bright, and the first house likes bright things because it's the sunrise. So this also has to do with the fact that the moon represents the mother and the first house represents the body. And if you know a little bit about metaphysics, you might know that actually the mind is the mother of the body. So maybe it's not a hard dichotomy, body-mind, because also it's mother-child. And they're in harmony on that topic, but they're out of harmony on the topic of private-public. So it's quite complex. And the important interpretation to bring forth from the harmony between the moon and the first house is that this person is well nourished. Like symbolically speaking, the mother takes care of this child, the moon in the first house. So the person gets good food. They get a lot of food. They eat well. Therefore they're strong. Therefore they look good. They're beautiful. Their body is healthy. They're beautiful. They get support. They have a mom, let's say, symbolically speaking. So they get support. So the result is they're physically strong, they're physically attractive, and they're emotionally strong and confident. Now that's a very clear theory of what the moon in the first house represents, or how you would interpret the moon in the first house. But until you really look at it in actual charts, the nuances and the reality of it won't really become too evident. So let's take the time to look at least 4 charts. We have Krishna, Rama, Oprah, and Priyanka Chopra. We'll start off with Krishna. So the dichotomy between the moon and the first house is manifest versus not manifest. Does that make sense with Krishna? Yes, very much. He's Param Brahman as a person. Brahman is this abstract, undefinable basis of reality, consciousness in an abstract form. But this is Krishna, an actual person with eyes, ears, nose, mouth, a defined person with a body, a manifest person, a manifestation of the unmanifest thing. And the second thing about the moon in the first house is the harmony between them, producing a person that's very beautiful and very confident. Is that Krishna? For sure, that's his trademark. That's what makes the manifestation versus unmanifestation so dramatic. It's not just a typical manifestation. This is the apex of physical beauty and sensual enjoyment. So what's going on with this chart? If you look at the moon in the first house, you'll notice that it's in Taurus. That means it's exalted. So whenever you have a planet exalted in a house, you should downplay the negative possibilities and upplay the positive. Upplay the beautiful and confident interpretation, and we would downplay a complexity of manifest versus not manifest, but kind of spin it into a positivity. So we wouldn't say Krishna has a hard time expressing his emotions, which we might say if it was somebody else with the moon in the first house. But we would say Krishna is very difficult to understand just by looking at him. On top of that, you'll notice that right next to his moon is Ketu. Ketu itself also represents invisible and unmanifest and internal. So you have a harmony between Ketu and the moon entering the first house. Right? Ketu is harmonious with the moon in the sense that they both withdraw. And they both are internal and unseen. So, in other words, the fact that his moon is with Ketu also helps put a positive spin on the manifest versus unmanifest dichotomy between the moon and the first house, because Ketu is on the moon's side of favoring the unmanifest. So you wouldn't think, here's a person who loses themselves by trying to express themselves to the world, or gets confused about themselves by trying to express themselves to the world. Rather, you would think, here's a person who the world cannot understand. Even when this person comes right in front of their face and says, hi, I'm XYZ, they won't understand, and they'll think he's ABC. One final thing that's very important about this chart, if you're going to interpret a planet in a house, you should always think about the nature of the house itself. So in other words, you should really look at the lord of the house. So since we're interpreting the moon in the first house, we would want to know about the first lord. His first lord is in a Raja Yoga with the 9th and the 10th lord, Saturn, in its own sign, Libra. So it's in a fantastic Raja Yoga. So that is going to do the same exact thing. It's going to mean this person has a lot of self, very strong self. They're not confused about themselves as it might be with somebody else's chart with the moon in the first house. Let's take a look now at Ramchandra's chart. So manifest versus unmanifest, again, yes, because he's a Vishnu avatar, so he's Brahman in a tangible form. Brahman is supposed to be intangible. But it's not as dramatic as Krishna. Because Krishna isn't just Brahman in a tangible form. Krishna is Brahman like as the most tangible form, the most beautiful, the most sensual, the most magnificent. Where Rama is more about his actions and his duties rather than his actual form. Is Rama, however, beautiful and confident? Super, of course. But again, compared to Krishna, it's actually a little bit more in the confidence thing and a little bit less in the beauty. Ram is the avatar of Krishna as a king, showing dharma and how to be a king and follow principles and morals and things like that. So it's his emphasis is more on the confidence and a little less on the beauty, although they're both super high off the charts. So having a look at his chart, his moon is not in Taurus like Krishna's. His moon is in Cancer. So that means his moon is domicile. So again, it's in a very good dignity, and then that also takes care of the first lord, but that means the first lord is in the first house. So his first house is doing great, but it's not as dramatic. It's more stabilized than Krishna's. Exaltation is more of a dramatic thing, and domicile is more of a stabilizing thing. Furthermore, his first lord is also in a Raj Yoga like Krishna's, but right there in the first house with Jupiter. That explains Ram. So this protects the seen-unseen dichotomy against any kind of deception. Right? The moon in the first house could be very deceptive. It's not showing what it really is. It's hiding what it really is. So a person can be very good at telling lies, for example. And Krishna is really on that theme. Very deceptive, tricky, very playful. But Ram is not. That's because Krishna's moon in the first house is with Ketu and exalted, while Ram's is with Jupiter exalted. Now, coming to more conventional people, how about Oprah Winfrey? Oprah Winfrey, how does that manifest versus unmanifest dichotomy work out for her? You can see it actually. Now it gives it a more concrete sense. It becomes a little bit less of an amorphous idea what that means. Because Oprah Winfrey is extremely famous, yes, but why? She's extremely famous for giving other people the spotlight. She ran or runs a talk show where it's her guests that she brings on that are really the focus. And she's the facilitator of it. So she's getting fame by taking herself out of center stage. That's very illustrative of the complexity of the moon in the first house and the dichotomy of manifesting, becoming famous, becoming visible, but not manifesting. Is Oprah beautiful and confident? I say yes to both, especially in the confidence thing. Taking a look at her chart, it also looks quite special. Her moon is in Sagittarius in the first house, so let's look at the first lord. The first lord is Jupiter. Jupiter is opposite. It's out there in Gemini, so the first lord is aspecting the first house and the moon in the first house. So the first house again is getting more stabilized, more confident. You're going to bring out the positive spins of the interpretation rather than the potential negative spins. The other thing is the only thing in the Kendra, or the central houses, those pink squares in the middle, the only thing is the moon and the first lord. So the person is very, very self-reliant. And the person is actually very, very visible and famous because the only thing that's in the center stage of her chart is the moon in the first house and her first lord. And the first lord is in the seventh house, which also describes a person that has fame by giving fame to others. And finally, let's have a look at the chart of Priyanka Chopra. Manifest versus not manifest. Here's another way that it becomes very real. Finally, when you see it in a real person, she's an actress. So she's not famous for being Priyanka Chopra. She's famous for the roles that she played. Of course, it's her playing the role, but you can see that kind of complexity. Who's famous? The character in the movie or Priyanka? She's not showing her real self. She's playing a different person. But that person is highly, highly visible. It's on a movie screen somewhere. It's broadcast to people's television sets and so forth. So moon in first house is a good candidate for somebody like an actor or an actress, especially if it's in an artistic sign like Gemini, which this is in her case. Is she beautiful and confident? Super. Extremely, extremely both confident and extremely beautiful. So what's going on in her chart? First of all, look, the moon is in the first house with Venus. So you have the two female planets, you have the two beautiful planets in the first house. So that's really going to enhance the beauty interpretation. It's also in a good sign for beauty, Gemini, which is in general just good for beauty, attractiveness, likability, and mutability, actually, changeability. So it's very good for an actress, a famous actress, a beautiful actress. One other thing you want to look at is where's the first lord? And you find out the first lord is in Cancer, and then that should all of a sudden ring a bell, because the moon is the lord of Cancer. We have an exchange between the first house and the second house. This is going to help all the interpretations and not put a negative spin on any of the interpretations. Especially, it's going to give some solidity and a lot of health and beauty. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.